I'm Alicia Willett. I'm the president and dean here at Albany Law School. I want to thank you all for coming to this event. We're excited to spend the next couple of days talking about cybersecurity. Some of you have never been to our campus, and some of you have never even been to Albany, so let me tell you a little bit about the place. We're proud of our historic city, and we're proud of our school. The school opened its doors in 1851. So this is the oldest independent law school in the nation. We have graduated a U.S. President, McKinley, and 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices, and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of judges, public servants, and leaders in all industries. So we are very proud of our school. We hope you enjoy being here. The room that you're sitting in was a 2-story library 30 years ago. And at that time, I don't think that we had too much material on cybersecurity. That, of course, has changed, and that's changed as a result of our new initiatives around the cyber issues that many of you are facing. Some of those initiatives are exciting. We have a concentration for our JD students so they can essentially major in cybersecurity and law. We have a fully online master's degree in legal studies with a concentration in cybersecurity and privacy. We offer classes such as information security, cybersecurity law and policy, cybersecurity in the public sector, technology, privacy in the law, global data protection law, financial services, cybersecurity and data protection, cybercrime and digital evidence, cyber warfare and cyber terrorism. Some of these classes, most of these classes are our own. A few of them are in partnership with the University at Albany. I would venture to say that the folks that celebrated their reunion last year did not have any of these classes. We're excited to be offering such new and cutting-edge classes. I'd like to recognize the person who's been the chief driver for these activities, and that is Dean Anthony Haynes, who's right here. This is Dean Haynes. None of this would be in place without him, including today's event. You'll be able to hear Dean Haynes speak on the opening panel tomorrow morning. Today's keynote speaker is Mark Zaid, and he'll be on in a few minutes. I'm not going to do the formal introduction of him, but I'd like to thank him for being here and note that he is a member of our Board of Trustees. He's also a graduate of the law school and was on campus just 2 weeks ago to celebrate his 25th reunion. At that time, he gave a presentation. He's a comic book collector and expert and gave a fascinating presentation on comic book characters in the law. There's a lot more lawyers in those books than you would imagine, including some very early women lawyers in these comic books. Fascinating stuff. The presentation has been given at other law schools and has been written about in New York Times. We were happy to have it here. So Mark, thank you for coming back 2 weeks later to present in other aspects of your work. As you know, these events and a 2-day conference like this takes just an enormous amount of work, and many of the people who have done that work are from our Journal of Science and Technology, and you'll see these students in the audience throughout the day. They do have to go to classes, so forgive them when they go. We make them. That's why they're here. But they're here to help you and to learn, and they've done the work of putting this together. I want to single out one person, Caitlin Balsamico. Caitlin is right here. So many of you have met her already. The folks who are presenting have communicated with Caitlin several times in the past several weeks and months. It takes an enormous amount of organizational skill and discipline to pull this off while going to law school, and one line on your resume doesn't do justice to all that you've done. But you've done just a fabulous job. We're lucky to have you, and I want to invite you to come up to introduce our keynote speaker. Congratulations, Caitlin, on a great program.
Thank you very much, Dean Willett. I would like to welcome everyone and joining us for our conference, Cybersecurity and Law. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors, the Center for Internet Security, the Sabota Lecture Series, and the Center for Privacy Law Center at Albany Law School, whose generous support made all of this possible. I am so appreciative of all of our esteemed experts in this field for giving their time and joining us to talk about this incredibly timely topic. And I'm also thrilled to see so many of our students here today to learn from our experts. It is my hope that our panelists themselves will leave our symposium filled with new ideas and approaches to their work. I would also like to thank my fellow members of the Journal of Science and Technology, especially Annalise Alasso, for all their hard work in assisting me in organizing this event. Many of our panelists submitted articles that will be featured in our upcoming issues. Finally, I wanted to thank our entire faculty and staff at Albany Law School, including Dean Anthony Haynes and Professor Robert Heatherly. I am forever grateful for your expertise and guidance throughout this entire process. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mark Zaid. Mark is a Washington, D.C.-based attorney who specializes in crisis management and innovatively handling simple and complex administrative and litigation matters relating to national security, international law, foreign sovereign, and diplomatic immunity, defamation, and the Freedom of Information Acts. Throughout his practice, Mark Zaid often represents former and current federal employees, particularly intelligence and military officers, defense contractors, whistleblowers, and others who have grievances, have been wronged or have been investigated by agencies of the United States government or foreign government, as well as members of the media. Since 2009, he has been named both a Washington, D.C. super lawyer every year, including being profiled, and a best lawyer in Washington Magazine's biannual designation for his national security work. Mr. Zaid is the executive director and founder of the James Madison Project, a Washington, D.C.-based organization with the primary purpose of educating the public on issues relating to intelligence gathering and operations, secrecy policies, national security, and government wrongdoing. Mark is a 1992 graduate of Albany Law School. He was an associate editor for the Law Review, and today he's a member of the Law School's Board of Trustees. Please join me in welcoming Mark Zaid.
Thanks, Caitlin. I appreciate it. When I was here from 89 to 92, I ran a number of conferences, especially in this room. I used to take advantage of that. So I remember the first big one was in 1990, and it's still on C-SPAN. It's the U.S. role in foreign assassinations. I had the former general counsel just step down from the CIA come and speak about whether the CIA was assassinating people around the world, and it got written up as if we were, which caused a number of problems, as he told me when I had dinner with him, that the Senate Intelligence Committee was calling him, demanding to know why we had changed the policy on foreign assassinations without telling them. That was because the Boston Globe mixed up what actually was being said. But when I watched that speech, I gave 8 minutes introduction, so I made sure I spoke a lot on it. And I had a very thick, still, Long Island accent, which I think 25 years in D.C. has gotten rid of. So I'll have to compare the two. But I also, when I was here, and I'm trying to think if I can remember where, I think in the back, so I think 2 seats to the right in the back was my seat in evidence, where I slept through most of that semester with Ken Malilly, who was our professor at the time. And for those who were here back at the time as well, Rob Heatherly, wherever he went, who was actually my classmate in 92, and Patricia Youngblood Rayan, who was my professor, and I was her research assistant in 1990, I think, and then Bob Batson, Bob and I, who was over at the Government Law Center, were in charge of the University of Rochester. I need to plug my university. The University of Rochester's Alumni Association here in Albany. So I used to give these lectures on the Kennedy assassination, and I spent 6 hours one night here in the New courtroom explaining why Kennedy might have been assassinated and who might have done it, none of which I think I believe now, after 25 years later, plus or minus. I assure you I'm not going to talk for 6 hours for today. I'll see if I can make it like to 30 or 40 minutes or so, and we'll go from there. But so let me sort of formally start. It is great to be back. I've been back 3 times in the last 4 weeks, both for board meetings, my reunion, and now here. It's great in particular that it's the Journal of Science and Technology that is hosting this as a primary. It was formed when Rob Heverly and I were here. Actually, one of our classmates, John Sassaman, was the first editor when the book came out, the first edition of the journal came out. And as it was said, I was law review. I don't hold it against you guys for science and technology. I've had more contact with you guys than I've had with the law review in 25 years, so that's okay. And the Ed Sabota lecture was started the year that I was here, so that was really nice. Now, since the time that I've been here on this topic of cyber law, cyber warfare, cyber security, incredibly different. You know, this was not a term that was in our vocabulary back at that time. I teach at Johns Hopkins a class in their master's program on national security and intelligence law. And my class this week, this past Tuesday, I had as a guest lecturer the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who's been a friend of mine for a long time. And we talked about a number of the issues that I'm going to talk about now. And he was the director from 1996 to 1999. And I asked him as well, you know, what has changed in the 20 or so years that he had been director to now. And he said even when he was there, this word, cybersecurity, you know, didn't exist. Now, we knew something about it, right? Unlike, wasn't Al Gore who invented the internet, the Defense Department actually did. But I remember when I was a freshman at the University of Rochester, my childhood best friend was a student at Yale, and he said I should go to the computer lab, wherever that is on my campus, and somehow I can send him a message through the computer. And I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. And of course it was some early version of email. When we were here, when I was here, I mean, if we had a computer, that was a big deal. We, of course, had no internet. The only thing that I knew from that was, as a member of the law review, and even just as a student, we had, I'm sure like today, free access to LexisNexis and Westlaw. And to have that for the first time was amazing. So I just kept sitting at the computer screen, just print page, print page, print page, print page, because it was all for free. So it was fantastic at the time. And I worked on all these issues that grew into what we're talking about today with terrorism and foreign assassinations, things that I actually do in my day job. The other thing that strikes me, one of my favorite authors is a man named Clive Cussler. You may know him. He wrote a book called Raise the Titanic, which was one of the worst movies ever made. Don't watch the movie, read the book. But he had a book called Night Probe, which, as a subplot, had a radical separatist Canadian group that was threatening to shut down New York State's electricity because we were getting, and I assume this is actually partly true, we were getting a lot of our power from the Canadian side of the falls and the lakes up there, and they were going to shut it down if they didn't get what they wanted. And I think about it, of course, they had to physically take over the plants at that time, whereas now, to do something like that by a threat, you could do it on a computer thousands of miles away in a dark room. And this transformation in that last quarter century, and especially where it's still going to go from here on, is one of the reasons, as the dean mentioned, that we have this Master of Science in Legal Studies with a specialization in cybersecurity and data privacy that Dean Haynes is doing. Now, this conference is going to deal with a bunch of those issues. I'm sorry I'm going to miss most of it. I got to go back home to DC. But I want to talk about some broad issues of cybersecurity and cyber warfare as it relates to national and personal security, which are two areas that I deal with in my law practice in Washington, D.C. Many of my clients who are within the intelligence community work every day on cyber issues, and the saying is often repeated, if you're not scared, you're not paying attention. And the more that I learn about these issues, the more I know how true that this is. One of the first things I want to talk about is something that for those of us who are lawyers, we don't pay very careful attention to. It is a growing topic, and that is, from a cybersecurity standpoint, how are we protecting our clients' information and our communications? Right? Rule 1.6 of the model rules within the ABA that most states, I'm sure, has adopted in some form or another, talks about how, in 1.6c, a lawyer shall make reasonable efforts to prevent the inadvertent or unauthorized disclosure of or unauthorized access to information relating to the representation of a client. It has become such a serious concern that on a number of occasions the FBI has issued warnings that hackers are specifically targeting U.S. law firms, especially the big ones, of course, the ones who are dealing with international cases and clients, particularly that have financial impacts. They talked about last year that a criminal actor posted an advertisement to hire technically proficient hackers for the purposes of gaining sustained access to the networks of multiple international law firms. Now, mostly that's for economic theft purposes, but every firm, even solo practitioners, my firm is a very small one, have a few lawyers who work for me, but we all need to be alert based on the risks that we face. Now, I'm often doing media work, television, radio, newspaper, on issues about national security. And I would be described as an attorney, a national security attorney who routinely represents covert intelligence officers. So you can imagine, I would suspect, I've never seen it actually happen that I have proof of, that my system would be targeted by any number of states, foreign actors that are adversary to our interests, Russia, China, North Korea, even friendly actors like Israel, maybe even my own government. But the problem is, whatever precautions that, especially those of us that have smaller firms take, it is incredibly expensive, and it is incredibly difficult. It changes all the time in trying to keep up with the technology. And I know firsthand what this risk is, because back in 2012, I was the victim of a peripheral attack by the group Anonymous, which actually I have more concern about than the U.S. government ever doing anything to me, quite frankly. Anonymous stole about 2 or 3 gigabytes worth of emails from my co-counsels in a case we were doing involving war crimes in Iraq, arising out of Haditha in November of 2005. And we were the defense counsel for one of the Marines who was accused of war crimes, and Anonymous had some issues with what we were doing. So they hacked my co-counsel's firm, grabbed all of the emails, there were a number of it, as well as other data, and just dumped it online. Now, obviously, a lot of the emails were communications between the co-counsels about strategy. Some of them were, goofing around like you just would with any of your friends who are colleagues. Nothing that was incredibly harmful at the end, maybe a tiny bit embarrassing here and there. But still, it gave me an understanding that, wow, there's a real problem that we can suffer as lawyers. And obviously the DNC found out about that as well in the last few months, and I'm going to swing back around to that in a minute. Now, we've also had where foreign state actors are dealing with law firms. And there was an incident that came out of the information that Ed Snowden, former NSA contractor, had grabbed some data, and it turns out Australia had intercepted a number of email communications between American law firms and the government of Indonesia that it was representing on a bunch of issues. Now, Australia wasn't targeting the American law firms, they were targeting Indonesia for a vast number of reasons in dealing with terrorism and multilateral economic treaties. Those emails were then turned over to the United States government, the NSA. NSA has provisions on how to deal with any time they have access to U.S. person information, and there's no indication they did anything untoward with it. But the documents that Snowden took, and I'm going to swing back around in a few minutes about that type of cybersecurity threat, revealed how vulnerable we were as lawyers in this particular field where communications are online and going through incredibly multitude numbers of servers. Now, I just created or co-created an organization called Whistleblower Aid, and it's at whistlebloweraid.org. We got a good amount of publicity, did it about a month ago. I did it with a colleague, a former client of mine who was a State Department employee, who was a national security whistleblower about surveillance issues. And we are now out there to provide free legal services to whistleblowers right now from the U.S. government, particularly in the national security fields. And John Ty, who's my co-founder, has made it an effort that we are to be the most secure law firm, hopefully around, in order to avoid the threats that I've already experienced. Now, part of that means we only communicate through secure systems. We'll only use Signal on our phones in talking because of the level of encryption from one side to the other. Because as is always pointed out, if one of you emailed me standing 15, 20 feet away, whatever it might be, using Gmail, it's not obviously just going that 20 feet or so. It's obvious, clearly it's going up into the sky to the satellite technology, but it is going through servers probably through a number of countries along the way. And in each time that it does that, it becomes more vulnerable. There's a case that some of you may know, and maybe someone will discuss on one of your panels, that's up at the Supreme Court right now, about whether or not U.S. law enforcement can reach into emails and other communications that are sent on U.S. company servers but are stored somewhere else in the world, and has a warrant to do so, to capture the information. So, serve Google and say, I want all these communications of criminal activity, but that email is stored in Bulgaria somewhere, and whether they can force Google to turn it over. It was Microsoft is the actual defendant. We also only use what's called Tor browser, and in order to, you have to download it separately. It's a free system, and it will mask where we all are. So, if you ever sign on to one of your computers from some other terminal, it'll send you an email and says, hey, I just saw that someone signed onto your account from another remote location. Is this you? And you either verify it or you say, nope, that's not me. Please shut it down. So the Tor browser will ensure that it looks like we are all over the place in the world so that the system can't be tracked. We will not accept any type of documents. You can disable the ability of the system to allow uploads, and that's because we don't want any classified information that is sent to us, as some whistleblowers will try to do, or some governments may try to do, in fact, to create a problem for us. So that issue, and I'm sure it shows up in the New York State Bar Journal, it shows up in the ABA Journal, it is an issue that we as lawyers, and I saw some heads nodding as I'm mentioning it, are struggling with, because I would say probably the vast majority of us here have not dealt with that cybersecurity threat that we have. In fact, the most recent 2017 State of Privacy and Security Awareness Report, which surveyed over 1,000 workers, said that 70%, this isn't necessarily lawyers, 70% lack firm grasp of security and privacy, although that at least went down from 88% the year before. Now, if we look at it from a U.S. government perspective, what I'm often dealing with as well, both offensive and defensive capabilities of the U.S. to combat cybersecurity issues. We are obviously concerned about nuclear, chemical, biological attack, any type of terrorism, but cyber war presents now a vulnerability in our society that increasingly worries anyone who understands it. And while we're paying attention to, say, North Korea's ability to launch a nuclear missile, determine whether it could reach us, if that range were sufficient, what's its accuracy, we can't lose sight of the thousands of people that North Korea has, that the New York Times reported actually just earlier this week, who all they do day in and day out is try to hack into our systems. since, in fact, in 2012, the United States intelligence community's worldwide threat assessment has listed cyber threat as a major danger to our national security. In 2009, the Pentagon created U.S. Cyber Command. Its mission is to conduct a full-spectrum military cyberspace operations to ensure U.S. and allied freedom of action in cyberspace and deny the same to our adversaries. Similar commands are all across the world. At least 29 governments have military or intelligence units specifically dedicated to offensive cyber operations, and more than 60 countries are developing cyber weapons, according to some surveys the Wall Street Journal had recently conducted. It's not just military. North Korea, in fact, has been using its cyber activities to expose vulnerabilities in the financial systems. They tried to steal $1 billion from the New York Federal Reserve, and only a spelling error stopped them from doing so. That one person noticed there was something that looked strange about this request and was able to stop it. But even then, they still got $81 million as part of their cyber theft. And it's not, though, a one-way conflict. We are doing it back and forth to one another. We've placed, supposedly, and since I have a security clearance, I always say, I'm not saying anything that I know from classified information. We and the South Koreans have apparently placed digital implants into the North Koreans' equivalent of the CIA. This is, again, according to documents that Snowden stole a few and released, that we have cyber and electronic warfare weapons deployed to disable North Korean missiles that apparently weren't as successful as we wanted to have. And it was just reported this past week that the North Koreans had apparently hacked into South Korean systems and stolen U.S. South Korean war plans in the event that North Korea might strike. Now, from a cybersecurity threat, it's not just who's coming from the outside, it's who's coming from the inside as well. And the insider threat in the last few years has become particularly significant. Insider threat could obviously affect and be involved with any number. It doesn't have to just be the government. Insider threat from companies, disgruntled employees, etc. But it's particularly damaging within the U.S. government in the cases that I deal with, where those individuals are stealing classified information and then disclosing it. Now, I actually would often say, because I do a lot of whistleblower work, I will say that regardless of where you fall on if Edward Snowden is a whistleblower, if whether or not what he did is positive or negative, I can tell you that the reaction from the U.S. government has been to create a vast problem for thousands of other employees who are only trying to do their job. And by that I mean, in the wake of Ed Snowden, it's just not just Snowden, in the wake of Snowden, the wake of Manning, in the wake of physical threats, like Aaron Alexis at the Navy Yard, where he shot and killed a number of people, the government now has reacted in a visceral way in trying to prevent those type of threats from happening again. So that you almost have a Red Scare paranoia type reaction that anyone who could fit a descriptive criteria of these individuals, of what led them to do what they did, fall under suspicion. And that creates, as you can imagine, a vast amount of problem, especially in the cybersecurity field and those that are trying to work on these types of actions. Now, what we also, though, did learn from Ed Snowden's documents as well was that NSA was hacked, kind of ironic. NSA was hacked and cyber tools were taken and ended up on the dark web where an organization was trying to sell them to the highest bidder, but then just deposited them online, which were then used to disable a number of infrastructure within the United Kingdom. It was also reported just the other day with respect to the Kaspersky. There was an article today saying how nobody could say that word properly. I guess it's true. That a Russian-made software tool for security apparently was either affiliated with the Russian government or hacked by the Russian government. I'm not sure if they've decided which yet, but that this tool, which amazingly a number of U.S. federal agencies are using. I mean, sometimes the steps that the U.S. government takes just kind of astounds me. The U.S. government bought a Russian security tool. Unbelievable. So now they have told everyone inside the U.S. government to stop using the tool, disable it, and remove it. Now, how did we find out about this? Because the Israelis apparently hacked into the Russians and found NSA information on the Russian servers, and then we all traced it back. So this is all going back and forth between everything. And in fact, just Tuesday, whatever the 10th was, the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, spoke at the Naval Academy. He talked very much about cybersecurity issues. Talks a little bit, his focus in fact was more on encryption, and another interesting legal issue that he raised. Because he was talking about what they're styling as warrant-proof encryption, and that it's defeating the constitutional balance by elevating privacy above public safety. He's talking about, for example, the situation we had with the iPhone and the San Bernardino terrorist attack, where we recover the culprit's iPhone to find that it has encryption technology on it, and we can't break into it. And they asked Apple to help them do so because, you know, if you try any number of times and you fail, the system will shut down, it will erase everything, and who knows what was on this phone that could lead to other perpetrators, conspirators. So Apple wouldn't comply, and ultimately it's been reported we paid some Israeli company to hack into the phone and successfully retrieve the information. But the Deputy AG talked about what they have styled as going dark, which they have styled as the threat to public safety that occurs when service providers, device manufacturers, and application developers deprive law enforcement and national security investigators of crucial investigative tools. Basically, we want you companies to essentially, although he says not, give us a back door, but give us an opportunity that if we need access to this information from a cybersecurity standpoint, you help us do it. Now, there's a lot of issues that raises that could take a whole course in and of itself. There's the privacy issues as one. There's definitely the public safety issues as two. But there's also the notion that these companies are profit-making companies. They are trying to do their best to tell all of us that they have warrant-proof technology. That is what some of us want. And so there's an interesting dichotomy that we have to deal with as lawyers, as consumers, as to where that line will fall. And I'm by no means going to answer where it should fall here because it's too much. But let's stick with Russia for a second and turn to the 2016 elections. Now, we've had the intelligence community say that the Russians, by using cybersecurity, impacted, influenced, affected, whatever word you want to use, the 2016 election. Now, the one thing, there's nothing about that that's new. The Russians for decades have been doing things like that inside the United States and worldwide. The only thing that has changed are the tools. It's a lot easier for them to do it. There was a report I listened to this morning. Actually, one of my clients at the Daily Beast wrote a story about how Don Jr. And Conway had retweeted Russian bot statements that they purported to be Tennessee Tea Party advocates in the days before the election. And we've now since exposed them as Russian bots. So now you have all these people that are around the world, don't have to come here, don't have to worry about creating newspaper ads, they can just do it online. We saw from allegedly Reality Winner, who's on trial for releasing classified information of NSA, that the Russians, in fact, because NSA at least acknowledged this as their document, NSA had indeed hacked into state voting machines. No indication they changed votes, but they were able to do so. We know now about Facebook ads that the Russians were paying for. We know, of course, like I said, about the Twitter bots. Now, interestingly, from the standpoint of the work I do inside the intelligence community, or representing those inside, I'm a little curious as to whether all of these allegations against the Russians are in fact true. Because I'm a little surprised that some of the bots, some of the companies were so easily traced back to Russia by specific companies. And I sort of throw out there that I wonder if some of this is actually U.S. disinformation, that we might have even set up some of these companies. I mean, there's no doubt Russia was engaged in a lot of these actions, but that some of them maybe weren't actually the Russians. But that one, I'm really digressing. We'll go down a different alley for that one. But one of the issues that I've had to deal with in relation to this cybersecurity threat that I've answered a bunch of times is whether the President of the United States, his family, or his allies like General Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor, did they commit treason by anything that they have done? Any of their perhaps collusion, which of course there's no such thing as a criminal act of collusion, but their collusion with the Russians. And people have been promulgating that, they have committed treason by dealing with the Russians on cyber warfare and cybersecurity. Well, treason is the only crime, actually, that's specifically defined in the U.S. Constitution. And under Article 3, Section 3, it says, whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason. And people say, well, Russia is our enemy. They're engaged in cyber war. It's got war right in the title, so clearly it must be war. So, very simple, they've committed treason. But this is where the lawyers come in, and war has been very specifically analyzed and defined, at least in the context of the Constitution, as constituting a state of open hostility and an assemblage of men in force. Basically conventional warfare. That is what treason has been looked at. Benedict Arnold, something along those lines. But is cyber warfare war? It's a fascinating question that hasn't been answered yet, and there's a bunch of problems with it. In fact, this morning, Nikki Haley, our U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, in fact said that this is warfare. So what does that mean? So I spent, 25 years ago, I had a 3-day conference in here on war crimes. Not too many students showed up, unfortunately, so I hope there's a number of students in here, but it was an awesome conference. And we talked about, for example, the Geneva Conventions. And under the Geneva Convention, you can't attack a church, can't attack a hospital. That would be illegal. But what if it's cyber war? In March of 2016, hospitals in Maryland, where I am, were hit by ransomware, and patients had to be turned away or were treated without their updated records because the hospital couldn't access them. Just this past May, medical facilities around the world were attacked with ransomware. Medical procedures were canceled, patient records were unavailable, ambulances diverted. If that was conventional warfare that had created all of that, it would constitute a war crime. So what do we do about dealing with this issue? One thing I throw out there, I don't know if there's room on any of the panels for discussion of it. We may need a treaty, an international treaty, to deal with cyber warfare. Now, the states' capacities for using modern information and communication technology to inflict grave harm on their enemies has really been demonstrated. These are some examples. Much of the conventional wars we've actually had in the last decade, when we've gone into Afghanistan, when we've gone into Iraq, actually were preceded by cyber attacks by our side into the Iraqi system, for example. We can affect military defense systems, water supply, critical infrastructure, going back to what I said about Clive Cussler, but now all computerized. And there are no international norms that are at least agreed upon to deal with international conflict in cyberspace. And these threats are incredibly real, and they're only clearly going to get worse. So those of you who are students in here, good luck. This is something that you need to figure out how to deal with, and you can hopefully do it as part of Dean Haynes' program, and in the master's program, or in the program under your JD. But these are things that we're going to have to address at some point in time. But the final thought that I'll leave with in trying to figure out what we're going to do about this, there's one big problem. We do it too. And how are we going to deal with that? I don't have an answer. So I'll leave that for the conference to try and figure out. Thank you. I think there's some time if anybody wants to ask any questions, and I'll do my best to try and answer it. Anybody got anything?
I apologize, I'm late, so maybe you can cover that. From a cost-benefit analysis, considering the fact that most of the briefings and reference to government cases have to do in connection with intelligence reasons or accessing these systems. Since we cannot obtain that information for all clients, or just certain clients, is there possibly a greater benefit that everybody has the strongest defense against that, so that nobody can get it?
So the question is, from a cost-benefit analysis of trying to prevent access, sort of what would be the strongest defense? Am I kind of getting that?
Yes. Let's suppose Apple and everybody else were put in a program that couldn't be hacked by cell phones or whatever. And everybody has that same capability to defend their information. I think this up was roughly, I would say, 15 to 18 years ago. Anecdotal information indicated that computer crime had surpassed narcotics. Now, in a long-term sense, I would say computer crime greatly surpassed that as an economic loss. So if you have a situation in which you have the strongest defense, this person computer is not everything. Maybe that would be better than worrying about the
Yeah, it's unfortunately probably the strongest defense against computer crime, cyber hacking, is for us to switch back to just writing in our notebooks. Most of my students in my master's class, they're always on their computer typing their notes, of course, and you don't see as much in the way of notebooks. When I had the DIA director in my class the other day, he was in fact talking, not just from a cybersecurity standpoint, but we're just talking about computerization, and one of the things that he mentioned was recently some drone programs, and sort of like peripheral, of course, what you're asking, but some of the drones that we operate apparently started talking to one another absent human instructions. And we set the drones off, and then they started to talk to one another to plot where they were going to go. And all that just came to my mind was the Terminator in 1984. And that everything that most of us here grew up with in a science fiction world is reality now. I always tell all my students, Star Trek answers every question. I can come up with any episode in a Star Trek series and come up with an analogy to anything going on today. The technological problem with the cost and the benefit is the U.S. government has an incentive to continue to try and hack all governments. The companies have an incentive to continue and try and prevent hack. All of it is economically derived. There is another topic of discussion that we could easily engage in is what role the U.S. government has with American tech companies if they witness or come across a vulnerability. This was something, obviously, that was recently discussed. NSA knew that their tools had been hacked for months and were out there and didn't tell anybody. And there are legitimate intelligence reasons why they wouldn't, but it's a very difficult public relations nightmare when it comes out that they didn't. Now, my own sense is that many of the technology companies, quite frankly, are cooperating with the U.S. government way more than what they're willing to acknowledge in doing so. And there's a lot of backdoor discussions and assistance that's there. Again, kind of going back to Snowden with the domestic surveillance issues, the one thing that really set off the discussion was the disclosure of a FISA, of a FISC, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court order to Verizon Business that Verizon Business had to turn over daily all of its metadata to the U.S. government. It had been doing that, or at least some of the technology, telephone companies had been doing that already for a number of years, is my understanding. But they wanted now court orders so that when it was discovered at some point in time in the future, they could have plausible deniability to say, I had no choice. I was ordered by the court to turn it over, even though that they were willingly cooperating before. I don't think there's ever going to be something as known as ultimate protection, because for every technology that is created to be warrant-proof, there's going to be somebody who their very job is to infiltrate and disrupt that technology, whether it's from the United States, Russia, Chinese, whoever that might be. That might be a little circular, circuitous route to your question. So the question is about the website for whistleblowing and making it sort of warrant-proof. So you know what we can't, to some extent, but that's one reason why we don't want documents. But we created a warrant canary, which I had never heard of until my technology people told me this. So under many of the national security letters, the FISA warrants, when I've represented clients, we're not allowed to say anything about the fact that a specific client has received this warrant for information under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Maybe sometimes in state or other regular federal warrants, I'm not sure. I mostly deal with it in the national security context. But what the government can't prohibit us from doing is sort of telling the truth. So on our website, it says somewhere on the website that we have not received any warrants for any information or something to that effect. And that if you come to our website and you have to know that it was there and you don't see this statement anymore, you can read into it what that means. Now, I'm a big fan of that because it's so broad as to what that means, and I don't like to play games with U.S. law enforcement and intelligence community. They're much bigger than I am. But that's at least the closest that we can come to try and give any type of warning to our clients, because we are concerned of anyone contacting us and the U.S. government or a foreign government trying to gain access to who that is. Right? There's another case that's going on right now, I'm blanking on which court, that's simply trying to get lists of communications to see who was reaching out to certain entities, which is just a stepping stone to then proving what that person might have done. I had a client who was prosecuted and is in jail right now for leaking classified information to the New York Times. And some of the evidence they used against him, it was a former CIA case officer, some of the evidence was they had metadata showing that he had in fact emailed to the New York Times. Now they had the emails, but they didn't say anything. And phone conversations. How long, on what dates, who initiated. It doesn't give the content, obviously, but person X has the information, person Y publishes the information, communications between person X, person Y, juror, figure it out on your own. And that was, among other things, sufficient for the jury to find him guilty and sentenced to like 3 years in prison.
How do you think the
So the question is on the militarization of cybersecurity, how will that impact everything? Hey, Terminator. I mean, it clearly is. I mean, the biggest concern, and that's why there is a big debate right now about an international treaty. And can there be one? How would we address it? And the problem is we've got numerous examples of cyber attacks that, if it were conventional, are clearly, I mean, no question about it, unlawful, war crimes. But it typically doesn't tend, that I know of, I'm not sure if, like, even in the ones that I mentioned, did anyone actually get hurt? I don't know. But you can envision how harmful a cyber attack can be that would lead to massive destruction. One of the big concerns right now, sort of related to cyber, because it would impact, it's not necessarily that the North Koreans can launch a nuclear missile and reach us or have the accuracy of hitting New York City. It's just that could they explode a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere above one of our cities, and the EMPs, the electromagnetic pulses, would destroy our cyber system. And what would that lead to if you imagine the entire system goes down? Or if you're a fan of Homeland, there was the second season when the vice president's pacemaker was hacked into and turned off, and he died. Hopefully I didn't ruin that for you if anyone hasn't seen Homeland. But they're like in their 6 or 7 seasons, so if you haven't seen it by now, sorry. Now, the DIA director who I mentioned, he said, look, that's always been a kind of rumor and an urban myth, not really true that they could do it because of the way the systems are, and they're always changing numbers or something like that. And I don't know what is true or not on that, but I can tell you when Dick Cheney was vice president, he had a pacemaker, and he was actually, there was at least reports, he was really concerned that that was a possibility. And he had internally the agencies look into it, and whatever they came up with, I don't know. And he's still around, good or bad, I suppose. Although sometimes I kind of want him back, which I won't get into on this. What's it called? Blockchain.
Really provide amazing security and transactions. They're talking about the use of it to protect voting.
So, it's in the wake of the 2016 election. So I think if I remember what I saw recently, something like, was a couple of dozen states were notified by the federal government that there was evidence their systems had been either hacked into or at least targeted. And there were a number of counties, I want to say like down in Florida, if I remember, but down south somewhere I think, who noticed that there were problems within their system before the election. Didn't necessarily know what or who, but we're switching to paper ballots because of the problems and concerns that they were experiencing or envisioned they might experience on election day. And I don't know specifically about blockchaining per se, but this issue is clearly one not only that we have to deal with, but the Europeans, which have just experienced it. And there was an announcement today, I think it was Secretary of Defense, I'm trying to think if it was Mattis who said it, but one of my clients over at NBC tweeted out that the Defense Department had testified before the Senate this morning that they have no plans in place on how to protect the upcoming 2018 election. Don't know if that's true or not. Again, my paranoia of the world that I live in, I always think there's disinformation going on from the U.S. government because there's no one to promote to your enemy that, yeah, we're ready for you. So Now, there's other questions about whether it's Defense Department for posse comitatus and whose role it really is, so maybe the Defense Department could actually say, we're not prepared, but by the way, the CIA is, you know, or the FBI or whoever, or actually Department of Homeland Security would really be the ones doing a lot of it. I guess what I turn it to have the other panels who have more substantive people who are dealing in that specific area, that is a perfect question for them, because that is a question that is going to have to be answered, and it's going to have to be answered real soon, because we have elections coming up, including, right, there's the mayor election next month here in the city, another alum and fellow board member. And I think I'm done at 1:30, so I'm going to stop now. I think we have 15 minutes to the next panel, so I'm staying around for that, so I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has in that time. Or you can email me. I think my contact information is in the program, so please do. But thank you. Have a great conference.
We do have 15 minutes until the next panel, and there's coffee, cookies, and water right outside of our booth.